Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this Education Writers Association webinar covering efforts to grow and diversify the teacher workforce. My name is Talia Richmond, and I'm a reporter with the Education Lab at the Dallas Morning News. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone a few housekeeping notes. First off, a reminder that this webinar is on the record and is also being recorded. So if you hopefully are writing an article based on this conversation, these are quotes that you can use. If you have questions for our speakers, you can type them into the Q&A box, and that'll be monitored by EWA staff, and we will be getting to those questions near the end of the discussion. When you do ask a question, please make sure to include your name and your affiliation, the newsroom or organization that you're coming from. Feel free to ask those questions at any time, and we will come back to them. And thank you to today's speakers. I'd love to introduce them. First, we have Susanna Craig, who's the Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Student Success at the Louisiana Board of Regents. She works on teacher recruitment and retention there. Next, we have Leslie Fenwick, Dean Emerita and a professor at Howard University School of Education. She is also the author of Jim Crow's Pink Slip, which was published by Harvard Education Press. Kristen Griffith is an education reporter at the Baltimore Banner, where she's reported on why Black teachers leave Maryland schools. This reporting was done as part of an EWA reporting fellowship, and it recently won a statewide award. So I encourage everyone to read that coverage. And then finally, Melissa Tooley is the director of the PK-12 Educator Quality at New America, where she develops and analyzes policies and practices that influence the quantity, quality, and diversity of educators in U.S. public schools. We're very excited to have this group and are excited for a great discussion. And I'd love to start that discussion by having Leslie give us some historical context to root this conversation about the state of diversity in the teacher workforce and how we got here.
Thank you, Talia. Can everyone hear me fine? Thumbs up. I'm really appreciative that EWA is canvassing this topic. And as you mentioned, most of what I'll say is coming straight from Jim Crow's Pink Slip. And I hope that your audience of journalists and others have an opportunity to read the book, or certainly look at some of the articles that I've written that summarize those findings. So I'm going to try to do this in 3 minutes. And you'll see me glancing down at my notes. So first, in many ways, we have misdefined Brown. That's not a new finding, but what is a new finding is this: that Brown and many of the decisions after it, especially Bradley and Singleton, Green and Lee, and numerous other decisions mandated that public schools integrate wholly, W-H-O-L-L-Y, meaning the superintendency, the principalship, the teaching force, and the student body, not just the student body. But what we have in our popular mindset, and even in reiterations, modern reiterations of the history, is that Brown was exclusively about the ratio matching of Black to white students. It never said that. It never intended that. And if we have any confusion, the decisions subsequent to it were very clear that integration or desegregation wholly meant the leadership, the teaching force, and the student body. And I believe and assert in my work, Jim Crow's Pink Slip, that the failure to integrate school personnel was and remains a great failure caused not by the decision. This was not an unintended consequence or an intended consequence of the decision. It was caused by massive resistance to the decision. So as journalists know, massive resistance was that strategy that was engaged in the 17 dual system states from as far north as Delaware down to Florida over to Texas. And it was intended to stall and prevent and upend the intention of Brown. And it resulted in the dismissals, firing, and demotions of 100,000 Black principals and teachers. So massive resistance resulted in the firing, dismissals, and demotions of 100,000 Black principals and teachers. And the problem was so severe that it reached the halls of Congress, and there were a series of US Senate hearings in 1971 examining this massive purge, this largest brain drain of talent from the US public school system and the history of the system. And what were the two most important findings of those Senate hearings that I discussed for the first time in my book? The first was that teachers, Black teachers in segregated all Black schools were more academically credentialed and professionally licensed than white educators in segregated all white schools. I'm going to repeat that because it's a narrative that has not been told, that Black educators in segregated all Black schools were more academically credentialed and professionally licensed than white educators in segregated all white schools. The second most important finding of those Senate hearings that I unpack in my book is that as desegregation unfolded on a near one-to-one basis, once Black educators were purged from the system, they were replaced on a near one-to-one basis by whites who were less qualified than they. And in so many ways, this legacy, this history is not dead. So prior to Brown, prior to massive resistance to Brown, 35 to 50% of educators in the 17 dual system states were Black. And today we all know the statistics. 7% of the nation's 3.2 million teachers are Black, about 11% of principals are Black, and less than 3% of superintendents are Black. There's an attendant to this. So prior to Brown and after Brown, and today in 2024, based on NCES data, National Center for Ed Statistics data, Black educators are the nation's most academically credentialed educator, okay? And yet tremendously underrepresented, not only in the national educator workforce, but even in urban centers. You go inside urban centers, 90% of teachers are white, about 73, 78% of principals are white. Go into inner cities, 73% of teachers are white, 68% of principals are white. Tremendous demographic mismatch between the student body in those settings and the school personnel serving them. When we get to the Q&A part, I'd really love to unpack how Black educators, during a time of incredible racial constriction, racism, endorsed by state law, became more credentialed and did this academic migration between the northern and midwestern states and back to southern schools to gain their academic credentials. This is a really, really important story. And just to kind of give a final summary of the impact of all of this, I want to read one paragraph from my book and then I'll stop and we'll go on to the other panelists. Black principals returned to the segregated border in southern states possessing superior graduate degree credentials and experiences with integrated education that their white peers didn't have, and I can unpack that later. As early as the 1920s, the famed segregated all-Black Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. had 3 teachers with PhDs. 2 of the school's first principals held graduate degrees from Harvard. Sumner High School in Kansas City, Kansas had a similar reputation. The 1926 roster of Sumner's faculty indicated that 41% of the faculty held master's degrees, including 3 from the University of Chicago. So that's 1926. By 1935, the percentage had grown to 61% with master's degrees from the University of Chicago, Columbia University, and Harvard University. Notably, with the integration of the school faculty in 1968 to include more white teachers, the percentage of faculty with master's degrees fell below its 1926 level to 35%. The point I'm making here is that we are living with histories that we do not know. If you have a question about how we arrived at the point of the underrepresentation of Blacks in the nation's educator workforce, it's tied to this history. Massive resistance to Brown. And it's not tied to the myth that we hear repeated in the press, in research, and even just in the popular consciousness that after Brown, Blacks fled the teaching or education professions to pursue other careers open to them. That's the myth and the lie. The truth is that we are at this point because we are living with histories, and many of those histories we don't know.
Thank you, Leslie, for drawing the line and outlining those ripple effects from that decision. Melissa, if you could next kind of give us the background on what states are doing to increase their teachers, keeping an eye toward diversity, quality, and quantity.
Sure. Thank you again for having me here today. I'm excited to talk about these issues and give folks a little bit more background about sort of where we've been and where we are. So I'm going to share my screen here. Give me 1 second. Can you all see that? Yep. Okay, great. So in the past 15 years or so, teacher policy conversations have really tended to have a really sort of singular goal. Policymakers have been really laser focused on quality for a while. There was a period where there was a lot of focus on teacher effectiveness. During the pandemic era, we had increasing concerns about quantity, and we see the conversation now increasingly turning toward one that's more about teacher diversity, ensuring that our teacher workforce reflects the student characteristics in our public schools. And one of the things we've seen, I think, most recently in conversations about teacher shortages is, this like, again, sort of singular, single-minded focus on quantity, sort of really leaving out the quality and diversity pieces. And again, we're seeing some shift on the diversity piece, but a lot of these efforts have been really in the research that we've done at New America's Education Policy Program, really short-sighted. They've been really focused on teacher quantity at the expense of quality and diversity, and actually some of the efforts to increase even quantity in the short term are having negative impacts and actually inhibiting both the quantity and the quality and the diversity in the long term. And I am excited to talk a little bit more later about a national scan that we did at New America of every state's different pathways into teaching, and some insights that we learned about each state's ability to sort of address each of these three pieces of the triangle, because really we need all three of those aspects to really be triangulated by state policy, either in an individual policy or sort of in a more sort of coherent, comprehensive way across their different policies. And so we've really, seen that there are a few efforts beyond sort of recent pushes for compensation in some located locales to make the job of a teacher more manageable and rewarding in order to retain current teachers. A lot of the focus has really been on bringing new teachers in without thinking about how do we retain some of the great teachers we already have, the ones that actually already have experience, the ones that are going to be able to actually help those novice teachers get their footing under them and really develop their craft. And so we've really been trying to reframe the question that policymakers are asking to be about why and how strategies can, again, sort of simultaneously target these three elements of quantity, quality, and diversity. 1 second. And so this is sort of how we're trying to rephrase the question here. And it's not just about the short term, it's about both the near and the long term. Like, how can we think about policies that can do both of those things? And just in terms of background on these issues, every state has its own unique requirements for obtaining a license and certification, which teachers need in order to be a practicing teacher. And so there's sort of what we consider a full license or certification, and those are typically for people who completed all the preparation requirements before becoming hired as a full-time teacher. And that's typically, I don't know, you may have heard it referred to as like traditional preparation, which is typically completing a baccalaureate degree with an education focus, doing some sort of student teaching, clinical training. So doing some like hands-on work in schools for at least, a couple of months. So that's sort of like the standard traditional way, but within each state, there are various alternative, we'll use that word for now, pathways to becoming a first-time teacher. And, we love everything to be different by state in our country. And so there's lots of different terms that you might hear to talk about that. There's, conditional certification or emergency certification, and each of these has its own set of requirements. So within each state, you have the sort of traditional initial license and certification, and then you have these other alternative ways to enter into teaching. And just to make it more confusing, there's this idea of like alternative pathways into teaching, and then there's alternative preparation programs into teaching. It's possible for an alternative preparation program to get you to that like full initial certification if you complete it before you enter teaching. Typically, alternative pathways, alternative preparation, we often think of as preparation that lets you begin teaching before you've actually completed your preparation. So I like to refer to those as fast track because, again, alternative is sort of this broader set of different kinds of preparation pathways and different licensure pathways. So I tend to refer to those as fast track programs. But there are also other kinds of pathways into teaching, for example, that don't require any specific teacher training, might require you to have specific subject knowledge, like we're targeting STEM teachers, so people who have industry experience in science or math, people who have specific skill sets in a language. And sometimes those people that we're bringing in are for like emergency certification might have almost no, there are almost no requirements that those people have to meet other than oftentimes having a bachelor's degree. But again, this varies widely by state, and we've done the state scan that sort of digs in to see which states have done a better job at this triangulation process. And there's some innovative practices that I'm excited to talk about a little bit later.
Thanks, Melissa. It's helpful to get on the same page with the language, and we'll unpack more of those pathways and what they really mean and what they really look like as we progress in the conversation. Susanna, I'd love if you could tell us more about the task force working on retention and recruitment issues in Louisiana, some of the strategies that your state has implemented and what you're seeing so far.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much, Talia. Very excited to be here and grateful to be included in this panel. In the state of Louisiana, we, just as all the other states across the country, we are grappling with these issues of not only teacher recruitment, but retention in the classroom. And we've even taken a one step further, recovery of maybe those teachers who have retired and drawing them back into the classroom. So in our Louisiana legislature in 2021, created this teacher recruitment, retention, and recovery task force. We lovingly call it our TUR task force, and further extended that work in 2023. And so we have been at this work diligently now for, I think we're about to head into our third full year, fourth year of this work. And so the task force was charged with studying two major issues in the profession: the declining enrollment in our educator preparation programs, and then to really research and focus on those strategies and best practices that the state, individual school districts, educator preparation programs could implement to kind of increase those rates of not only employment, but retention of the teachers within their systems. So we have launched, and I'll just highlight three right now for time. But our pre-educator pathway is a program. We've got some really strong grow your own models, taking those students who are still in high school, who teachers have identified as service-minded individuals, and saying, you might be that spark for someone else. And these students are getting dual enrollment credit for some of those early education courses that they might take on a college campus, and really getting to experience some not really residency, but some experiences, some real life experiences while they're still in high school, as they're making their decision about where they might want to go to a post-secondary institution. And we have many who are choosing education as their field. We've had a 15% increase in the participation of students enrolling in these grow your own models, and then also dual enrollment, taking education courses while still in high school. We have a very strong quality paraprofessional to teacher model. This is a 2 to 3 year process. We are working with those paraprofessionals who are already on a campus working. And for those of you who don't know, a paraprofessional is a professional who acts as an assistant in the classroom to the regular certified teacher, either in a special ed classroom or a pre-K or kindergarten classroom in the state of Louisiana. Many of these do not have, only have a high school diploma. And this is a way that that our state has worked with a program to have affordable way for them to earn a bachelor's degree while they are still teaching in they're in a classroom setting every day. The third biggie I think I'll highlight right now for time's sake is that this commission, and I didn't mention that this commission was legislatively created, but it is the makeup are state legislators, representatives and senators, the heads of many of the organizations, the Principals Association, the School Boards Association, the Superintendents Association, the teacher unions, the charter school organizations. So everyone who has a voice in this issue is sitting at the table with us to help us make this decision. And so with that, one of the barriers that we found is that in the state of Louisiana, a candidate would need to pass the Praxis Core test, which is a basic skills test similar to an ACT or another a test like that, to be allowed entrance into the educator preparation program. It's the only program in Louisiana where that is a requirement, that you have to take the ACT to get into college, but then you also have to take the Praxis to get into your college. Engineers don't have to do that. Nurses don't have to do that. And so we as a commission, this became a really kind of a charge to the legislature, and we were able to go to the Louisiana legislature and get that basic skills test removed for entrance into EPPs, as well as for certification. The content area exams are still in place for certification, but we think this was a really good first step, and I'll give you just a few statistics. There it is. We've in our HBCUs, we've seen a 33% increase in enrollment at our historically Black colleges and universities in the state of Louisiana, of which we have 3 have a teacher preparation program. And then we have also seen a 33% increase in enrollment and completion in all of our educator preparation programs, simply by removing the Praxis Core. So excited to be here today and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Susanna. We'll get into the specifics of some of those potential solutions later on in the conversation. Kristen, you recently did a deep dive into why Black teachers are leaving the classroom in Maryland. I'd love if you could share with us what you learned and how reporters should approach stories like yours.
Yeah, thanks for having me, EWA. Thank you for the introduction, Talia. Yeah, my story, Black teachers are leaving. How can Maryland schools get them to stay? Pretty much started after coming across a statistic in Maryland that the Black teachers are leaving at a higher rate than other races. So of course I wanted to explore why that is. And after a bunch of interviews with current and former Black educators, 3 things stood out. One was, as Melissa was talking about, the certification issue. A lot of teachers in Maryland have what we call the conditional certification, which allows you to teach while you're also getting the credentials needed to become a licensed teacher. Black teachers in general have pointed out that that's a difficult process to navigate and it costs money, but it's resulted in, it gets a lot of Black educators in the door, interestingly enough, but it also leads to turnover because of a lack of support when navigating that, which brings me to number 2 is a lack of support. Mentorships or opportunity to grow. That's something that Black teachers said they went without when they were looking back on why they left, but it was also a reason why Black teachers said they stayed. It's because they had that support in place. And then number 3 is being the only one who looks like them or one of few. I'm sure if you're a person of color, you know how that feels. I'm sure other demographics do as well. When you're the only one who looks like you don't have people that can relate to you, and you can feel lonely. So those are the themes I've came across, but in this piece also wanted to highlight the solutions part of it too. Spotlighted a school on Maryland's Eastern Shore with a principal who was very intentional about not only recruiting, making sure that she found educators of color to join her staff, but building relationships with them to get them to stay, which goes into the support we were talking about. And as far as stories being done, I would encourage journalists to pull or request data that looks at the attrition, asking or looking at that demographics. Do they also see a certain demographic leaving at a higher rate than other schools? Also encourage you to look at your certification process. I can't imagine that, as Melissa brought up as well, I can't imagine that Maryland's the only state that has an issue with that. Do they have supports in place to help with that? Susanna talked about a task force in Louisiana. I think Baltimore City had one of those where they noticed that their retention was also bad among Black educators, but they couldn't, it seemed from their perspective, didn't get the administrators or central office folks on board to help with that. So I can speak more about possible stories to look into, but yeah, I just wanted to move things along. But again, thanks for everyone for joining.
Awesome. That leads really nicely into the discussion we're going to have. I'll be asking a question, and I can kick it to one person in particular, but then everyone should feel free to jump in if you have thoughts. So like you were saying, Kristen, there are some promising strategies that different individual schools, principals, or states have implemented. And you touched on this, Susanna, but the paraprofessional to teacher model, what is some of the evidence that that's working, and what are some of the other promising strategies that you and other speakers have seen when it comes to improving?
Sorry, to unmute. Well, I think one of the things that we have seen is that this paraprofessional to teacher model has increased access for students, because not only is it affordable, but the students can do this while they are in their own school setting. So they don't have to leave their school setting to actually go to. So it is online, but with supports, with mentors coming in supporting directly at the school site. We've got a rural initiative where they are actually going into the schools in these rural sites where candidates are these paraprofessionals. There isn't a university within 60 miles of them. And so we are really doubling down on focusing on the areas of the state that, especially our rural areas, to help with this model. Also, they're actually, because they are working with students on a regular basis, it's a very practical way for students to study their degree program while they're working with students on a regular basis. So earning a wage, and while also getting an affordable education, we think is a real plus. And we're meeting some students that they had thought getting a bachelor's degree was outside of the realm of possibility for them. So for us, it's about access.
Perfect. For the other speakers, are there any strategies that really are giving you hope?
I'll chime in on that, Talia, to amplify much of what Susanna said. I also serve as Dean in Residence at the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, AACTE. And we did an analysis of the history and use of licensure exams and cutoff scores, and had a 14-state consortium of faculty, State Department officials, and others who looked at how cutoff scores for the entrance licensure exam were set. And what we found, and I see Susanna shaking her head yes, what we found is that the scores were typically set not in a kind of psychometric exercise, but by a task force using the median or mean scores for all test takers, which tended to be 1 to 3 points higher than the median or mean score for African-American test takers. So we were doing two things. One, for the first time in the history of the profession, I'm a teacher education graduate from way back when, and we had one test. It was an exit licensure exam, the NTE. We introduced the praxis exam. And the interesting thing is that you're talking about individuals who have been accepted into college and are in the second year of their college education, taking an entrance exam into their major, which many of us in the profession see in two ways: unnecessary, because we're talking about college students, and two, when the cutoff scores are set for those exams, they tend to have an obliterating impact on the Black teacher pipeline and also the Latinx pre-service teacher pipeline. We believe in exit assessments, but this assessment seems unnecessary, and we know that it has a tremendous racial disparity. It produces tremendous racial disparities in terms of who passes and fails the test and who enters the profession as a college student. So AACTE published a policy monograph about the use and impact of entrance and exit licensure exams in teacher education. Your audience can find that on AACTE's website.
Perfect. And you should be able to find that in the chat as well. And talking about the pipeline, HBCUs and HSIs produce such a significant number of the nation's teachers of color. Leslie, do you want to kick off how those institutions can be better supported and utilized in this broader effort?
Thank you for that question. So, HBCUs still in 2024 produce about half of the nation's African-American Black teachers, even though they're less than 3% of the nation's nearly 5,000 colleges and universities, and 2 HSIs, one in Florida and one in Texas, produce 90% of the nation's Latinx teachers. So these institutions, selected HSIs, and all of the HBCUs are strong engines for the production of teachers. And though I've seen increasing federal support, especially during the Biden administration, to these institutions, I would like to see more. I see, quite frankly, and I know this is all on the record, too much philanthropic support going to fledgling, novice, new nonprofits who proclaim a mission to prepare more teachers of color and yet have no track record in having done that. Meanwhile, these institutions that have a long, storied history of preparing teachers and contributing to the nation's goal to diversify its educator workforce receive far less philanthropic and other support. So I would really like to see an examination of that and why that is so, that philanthropic support goes to these novice fledgling nonprofits when these strong engines for production of Black and brown teachers struggle financially. I'll tell a story very quickly. When I was dean, each year we received from our provost, the deans at the university, a roster of the GPA and financial need, that the median GPA and financial need for students who dropped out of our undergraduate programs. And for teacher ed, it was a 3.2 and $2,500. So we were losing talent, not students who had a 2.1 or 2.2. We were losing talent because of financial need. And that financial need was only $2,500. So investment makes the difference between retaining and promoting talent and losing it.
like to jump in there. In fact, I'll be brief. But two things. I agree completely with what you were saying, Leslie. And why in Louisiana it was so important to remove that practice core. It was critical to our HBC. We have one HBCU where the enrollment increased 50% in one summer once this was removed. We also in Louisiana have an HBCU advisory council that the teacher recruitment and retention council task force works directly with and closely with, so that we can make sure that the policies that we are putting forth for these HBCUs is supportive. Our third piece that I wanted to talk about is our Go Teach Fund that has been established through our legislature to help undergraduate students with tuition if they are going to be a teacher and they are in teacher preparation programs. So that is one way that we have financially are supporting these students. And you're right, sometimes it was a very small amount of money that would stop a student from continuing their degree program. And for another day, but there's a lot of student success issues, parent teachers, childcare that this is not the day for it, but if you want some stories, it's the other things that are stopping our teachers from finishing their degree program, not that they are certainly not capable of finishing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
I'd love to jump in before we move on to the next question related to the discussion we've been having. It keeps coming up, I think, in all the questions around licensure exams and other entrance requirements into the profession. And I just wanted to clarify for folks on the call that there are a variety of different requirements to enter teaching. Again, depends on the state, depends on the pathway into teaching. And there's like a general skills type of licensure assessment. And then there are also oftentimes more like pedagogy, teaching, instruction focused tests. And there are also content tests. And again, what is required really depends on the state. And it's just really important to, when thinking about removing requirements into the profession, we certainly want to look at which are the most likely to be barriers to entering the profession, specifically for teachers of color. But we also want to look at which requirements are most highly correlated with actually being successful in the profession and remaining in the profession. And so things like these general skills assessments that I think folks have been alluding to, the speakers here have been alluding to, yeah, like using that as like a prerequisite that you have to have a certain score on a certain skills test around math and reading. That may not be appropriate, especially when you're entering a teacher preparation program. It's like, well, maybe you should expect the teacher preparation program to build those skills, right? Like we don't want to bar people from entering even the attempt to become a teacher. But thinking about like, can you actually demonstrate your instructional competencies? That might be something we want to keep in place. And again, looking at whether these are actually connected to people's success in the profession. There's data showing that candidates' GPAs are much more likely to be connected to their later success teaching than something like a test score. And so we've actually seen a lot of states do some interesting things over the last few years. And in some ways, the teacher shortages have inspired states to kind of think outside of the box. And there have been a few that have done these interesting sort of like menu approaches to requirements to enter teaching. Pennsylvania's one, Alabama's another, but basically saying like Pennsylvania basically has this like sliding scale, like, here's our GPA cutoff and here's our licensure test cutoff. But if you have a higher GPA than our cutoff, like we'll let you have a lower test score. If you have a, higher test score, we'll let you have a slightly lower GPA, and sort of doing this. Because I think like part of what we're really trying to bar against is these like black and white, here's the line, there's no flexibility. And so I think there's some promising practices happening. And I think journalists can help highlight that it's not like throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't need any requirements to enter teaching, but we want to be really selective about what those are and also really thoughtful about how we implement those. So I just wanted to flag that. I think another interesting thing we saw in our scan is this idea of like a last mile pathway is what we're calling it. Basically for candidates who've not been able to meet a specific requirement, often passing a licensure test and giving those individuals the opportunity to begin teaching while they attempt to complete that requirement. TBD on sort of how that plays out, whether those candidates are actually able then to be successful and remain in teaching. But I think there's a lot more innovation happening. And I really would recommend that folks look into those when you see your state sort of making maybe more like black-white decisions about how they're thinking about requirements into teaching.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question to the group before we move into Q&A. It's a two-parter. So what story idea would you, from your place in this discussion, like to see reporters pursue? And if they do take on that story, what are some of the kind of mistakes in coverage that you would warn them not to fall into? Kristen, do you want to get started from the journalist perspective?
Yes, I was actually taking notes when my fellow panelists were speaking because I am working on a story now looking at the certification issue in Maryland. Like I think I mentioned before, a lot of the conditional certifications, which again means that teachers, often career changers who didn't come up through the traditional pathway or didn't study an education preparation program, and when getting their bachelor's, they get this temporary teacher license that allows them to get into the classroom and also at the same time taking classes or taking the exam to make them a certified teacher. Maryland, since the pandemic, after of course losing a lot of educators, they made it so these teachers, educators who already have this license, which is only supposed to last 2 years, allowed them to renew it an extra few times. So now, at that time, they could have it for 6 years. And just this past April, Maryland has created a new license, a conditional license that is 5 years and you can't renew it. But if you got a conditional certification before April, and between 2020 and April 2024, I believe, then you can add on those 5 years to the years you already have, which can lead to a teacher being on this conditional certification for 10 years. So I think it's very interesting. That was a mouthful. I think it's very interesting to see this balance between how are we getting educators in the door, especially teachers of color in the door, but also how are we getting the most qualified, the best educators in these schools, because as I'm sure a lot of us know, the teaching profession is not very attractive nowadays, and it's not very popular. And in Maryland, we are in what is considered an import state, where we have to, or we're often getting teachers who came from outside the state. So I say all that to say that I think it would be interesting to looking at these certification processes if it's leading to turnover. But I also think it's worth asking your local universities, how are you recruiting students in these programs? How are you recruiting students of color? But then also put the onus on the public school systems too. We already talked about, or Susanna mentioned, growing your own. I think that's a good solution to this, it seems. But also, do you have the teachers academy that we have in Maryland, the CTE program, where you're pulling high schoolers and having them start either dual enrollment programs or giving them education classes early on. I mean, I think we need to start exploring what these institutions that are already in place are doing to get the profession more popular so that we can deal with or prevent this teacher shortage that we're in today. And also diversifying this field as well, especially in those states like Maryland, where there are more students of color or Black students than there are Black teachers or teachers of color.
I'd love to follow up on that, Kristen. Thank you for raising so many great points, particularly around this issue on when reporting, thinking about, I feel like oftentimes I see reporters talking about bringing in new teachers and not enough focus on keeping the teachers that we have. And there is this sort of interesting piece that Kristen alluded to, where there are some teachers that recently were these new teachers that we've just brought in through some of these alternative pathways into teaching, but there's really no clear pathway for them to stay in teaching without having to jump through a bunch of hoops of that sort of like traditional preparation process. And for many who are, career changers, have families, these are not, 18-year-olds coming into, college for the first time. They don't, from a financial and time perspective, like that's just not an option for them. And so how are states thinking not just about how do we get folks into the profession, but how do we keep them there? And thinking about this balance and this nuance of, do we want to have a revolving door of these sort of novice teachers that get a couple of years of experience, their certification times out essentially, and then we just have to bring in somebody new to replace them? Or do we want to, we've already invested 3 years in that person and developing them in schools, they're basically learning oftentimes on our students, but like they've now got this experience. How do we support them in those initial years in the profession? And how do we create a pathway, perhaps one that's more based on competency than on, a certain set of like checkbox requirements for keeping those folks in the profession? And then just broadly, like, how do we shift the way that we organize our staffing in schools to make teaching more rewarding, help teachers feel more effective? Some of the things that Kristen reported about was, teachers feeling, like they wanted to be more collaborative, wanted to be more supportive. And teachers are still really in this like isolated, like one teacher, one classroom model. How do we think about ways to just even like reorganize schools to make them a place where more people want to teach? I mean, clearly there are lots of issues around compensation and other things, but how do we modernize the teaching profession? Are there places in your states that are doing that? I know that there's a couple of organizations like Arizona State University, for example, who's got like initiatives that they're trying to help local education agencies think through these things. So really like thinking even like beyond certification to like, what are these other things that are keeping people in the profession, making them satisfied in the profession? We have to have this very negative lens about, oh, no one wants to be a teacher. And I think that almost does like more of a disservice to trying to get people into the profession. So yes, there are lots of issues that need to be addressed. How do we highlight places that are doing a great job at it?
One novel story that hasn't been done is an examination of how much states are spending to have entrance licensure exams. So our state's spending, I'm just making up a number, $1.8 billion with testing companies to enforce entrance licensure exams. Keep in mind, there are two. They're the entrance licensure exams, the exit licensure exams. Most of our profession has existed with an exit licensure exam alone. So why are states spending taxpayers' dollars to test again college students to enter the profession? Why are they doing that? These students are in their second year of college, have taken an ACT and an SAT. We need an exit licensure assessment. It may or may not be a standardized test, but if we know that the entrance licensure exams have a disproportionately negative impact on the diversity of our nation's educator workforce, and the majority of Americans say in polls that they support an integrated educator workforce, what amount of money are states spending with test-making companies to reduce and constrict that educator workforce? That's the first story I'd like to see. The second is that the loss of Black educators is not a contemporary last decade phenomenon. It's traceable not to the Brown decision, because people will say that, unintended consequence of Brown. It's traceable to massive resistance to Brown, which was a strategy to upend and derail the decision. And I'd like to see a greater exploration of that by journalists, that we're living with this history still today.
Suzanne, if you can unmute.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, I promise. I want to also highlight that stories that need to be about legitimizing the teaching profession, especially we've got many candidates who go through college and then they do a student teaching or a year-long residency in Louisiana. It is not a paid internship, right? And many fields have paid internships. And one of the things that we are doing in Louisiana is to have the residency experience registered as an official apprenticeship with the Department of Labor. And I think it would be interesting, a story to see how other states are handling this, so that this semester in some states or year in other states can be an actual paid residency for that candidate who's in a classroom 8 hours a day as part of their degree program, but still needs to feed their family at night, or, have a family at night and might still need to work. So I think that's a good story there to kind of look at what's happening across the country regarding residencies and apprenticeships.
Yeah, absolutely. We have had a lot of conversations about residencies down here in Texas. Our education commissioner always says, we should be training teachers like doctors. Doctors only have to perform brain surgery on one patient at a time, but teachers have 30 that they are shaping. So I'd love, we haven't gotten any questions yet. So if people have some, I'd encourage them to put them in the chat. But while I still get to ask questions, I'd love to have someone weigh in on residencies and the power those programs, apprenticeship programs, can have, and if they have any research they could point reporters to as well.
I'm happy to start here. So New America has done work on looking at, I think, again, there's lots of different terms that we've thrown out there today. One is around teacher residencies, and these tend to be full year embedded in classroom training programs. I know some states use the term resident to actually mean like a teacher who has come in before having any preparation. So just clarifying that we are talking about this sort of year-long student training model. And basically, there are very few pieces of evidence of like what kind of preparation is most successful for a teacher, and really the only piece of evidence that really has strong back to it is around clinical practice. This idea of like being in a classroom, and particularly with a residency, where you see the full year, you see how teachers set up the classroom environment, how they build rules, and the implementation of the curriculum over the course of an entire year, how you wrap up the year, is really been shown to have, especially on retention, really strong outcomes. And that while teachers may not be much more effective like in the short term, that like in the longer term, those teachers do tend to be more effective than teachers who are prepared with less of that sort of hands-on kind of training in the beginning. Residencies and apprenticeships are similar in some ways and different in other ways. Apprenticeship models are oftentimes for people who don't necessarily have their bachelor's degree yet, whereas residencies tend to be more for people who already have their bachelor's degree and are oftentimes earning their master's degree as they progress through the training program. But both residencies and apprenticeships have this sort of dual, I'm training, I'm doing coursework at the same time that I am doing hands-on job training. With an apprenticeship, you're taking on more and more responsibilities over time, and there's like a very clear model for like demonstrating a competency over time to move to the next model, whereas residency is like a little more open-ended about how you have to do that necessarily, but both are working with like a mentor teacher that's really helping that person put some of these practices in place.
And I do think you have to, again, clarify that it's different state by state, because in the state of Louisiana, the year-long residency is the last year of their undergraduate degree program. It's maybe different in other states. So
Yes,
you really
Louisiana
have to
is
take a
unique.
look at state by state how they are using those terms. Leslie, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Susanna. So I'm just coming from having done the keynote at the National Center for Teacher Residency, their annual convening, their national symposium. And one of the things I'll say about the community of universities and nonprofits that are engaged in that work is they're very enthusiastic and very mission focused. I mean, there's a real palpable excitement about the work that they're doing and having an impact. AACTE, again, I wrote a policy monograph for AACTE, A Tale of Two Cities, where I looked at state evaluation systems. It was a 50-state scan to see how they're using various preparation paths, as Melissa said, and the outcomes of those paths. And there were two remarkable findings from this work. First of all, there's great variance, as Melissa has already said. That's the nature of our education system. But one of the things that was disconcerting, and I know journalists have attended to this in some ways, but maybe we need more attention to it, is like right now, 38% of our special needs teachers, special education teachers, are coming through alternative pathways that are not IHE based, not institutions of higher ed based. And I think we need to attend to that. In most of those cases, in most of the cases where you're coming through a residency, apprenticeship, some alternative path, you're teacher of record on the first day. And you're not prepared. Now that's our 50-state analysis that was published. You can take a look at the document, and I'm talking about special education teachers in particular there. The other thing we have to attend to is that already, if we're in a school where half of the kids are Black and brown and half are on free and reduced lunch, an indicator of poverty, they're 70% more likely to have a teacher not certified in the subject area he or she is teaching, or have a college major or minor in 4 classes. So I go to English, my teacher has no certification, she has a geography degree, but she's teaching me language arts. I go to my math class, my teacher is a phys ed teacher, he's certified in phys ed. So we can't have this kind of 2-tiered system of who gets access to quality teachers. And we know that there's that disparity. And we also know from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that the model of disproportionately placing uncertified individuals in classrooms predominantly serving Black, brown, and poor children is discriminatory and does harm. That's what the Fifth Circuit Court's decision said. So this is complicated, and I just encourage reading that Tale of Two Cities, the 50-state state evaluation system report. I think it will help journalists get a handle on these moving pieces of state legislation and how it impacts the quality of teachers and who gets what teacher.
Thanks, Leslie. My first policy recommendation would be every state needs to get on the same page about what words they're using to describe these programs. I think that would make it comparison much easier.
Yeah, I do just want to clarify, and Leslie, I'm not sure if you misspoke, that there's sort of these like fast track type alternative pathways into teaching where people do not engage in substantive training prior to becoming a teacher of record. Residencies and apprenticeships typically do require an individual to complete an entire year of student teaching, essentially, where they are working alongside a fully certified teacher in that teacher's classroom, but they are not the teacher of record. So I just wanted to.
No, I didn't misspeak. This is my 40th year in education, and I'm a former teacher. So I didn't misspeak. In the cases of schools and districts that are serving larger percentages of Black, brown, and poor children, they are ending up with the individuals who have not had the training more often than other settings. So that's the shading. So I'm looking specifically at who's getting these folks who are practicing, what students are getting these teachers who are practicing on them. And that's
right. I think the point of
that's real
disagreement may be that most residency, I think all the residency and apprenticeship programs that I am aware of require aligned coursework to be taken at an IHE at the same time that they are doing.
The ACTE monograph that I wrote, state by state, looks at all the alternative paths. One of the alternative paths are residencies and apprenticeships, but those are not the only alternative paths. So just as we said earlier, one of the frustrations, I thought you made a great point of this, Melissa, that We have these 50 states. They have all kind of languages. Talia keeps telling us, you've told us that, and they have all kind of routes. And the analysis in the policy monograph that I wrote is intended to collapse by state. These are the alternative routes, and these are the impacts. But overall, across the 50 states, the Black, brown, and poor students have teachers of record who are coming through these non-IHE traditional pathways and are teachers of record with no preparation. That is disproportionately affecting Black and brown and poor students.
Thank you both for clarifying. And this is a very complicated issue, so I'm glad we could, talk about that in a little more depth. I know we are at time here, but I did just get a question from someone. So if we could really quickly try to respond to that. This person has asked, how can district leaders find a balance between trying to kind of spread the teachers of color that they do have out so that students of color, see themselves represented in their schools, but also making sure that those teachers don't feel isolated as a result of, I guess, kind of, trying to spread folks out so there's some representation throughout, if that makes sense. If anyone wants to take a very quick effort at answering that.
I'll just quickly say, and if you look at the link that Casey shared that talks about a post that New America did on grow your own programs, residencies, registered apprenticeships, there's a really great chart in there that sort of shows the distinctions between them, but it talks about cohort models as being one of the elements of residencies. And so even if perhaps residents are in different schools, oftentimes residencies have a higher proportion of candidates of color, and even being able to come back together as a cohort and discuss some of the issues they're facing and have support, even if it's not necessarily immediately in their school environments, because again, this is like a change that's going to take place over time, but to at least have that support within their own cohort. And I'm sure, Leslie, at HBCUs, similarly, right? If you're sort of working in conjunction with other candidates of color, that you can sort of find some of those supports in that network, even if they aren't necessarily in your school environment, as we start to build more and more teachers of color in our schools.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Leslie, did you have something to add really quick?
I think partnerships with HBCUs, even if your district is not in the state of an HBCU or HSI, is helpful over time, right? So even when I was an associate dean at an HBCU in Atlanta, we had a partnership, guess what, with Fairbanks, Alaska. Who would imagine? But the district came to our educator job fair, and over time, we had a path of African-American teachers going to Fairbanks, Alaska. So the job fairs, having representation at the HBCU and HSI job fairs, I think will be helpful to Melissa's point.
And I'll add one final piece. I think school systems and school districts need to recognize that this is a concern, valid concern, and be intentional about being the solution to the problem and not ignore the problem. So I think that would be my final comment.
I think that's the perfect place for us to end, being solutions minded. So thank you so much to our panel for a fantastic conversation, and to Talia for a wonderful job moderating. And thank you to everyone who attended today. I dropped a link to an evaluation form in the chat, but we'll also send it by email. If folks could take a couple minutes to give us some feedback, that would be great. We really appreciate it and use it to improve our offerings. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.